Today, staff, I would like to talk to you on the subject, what to do in a crisis. Several years ago, my friend Ron Jensen read this little story to a group of us in a leadership conference, and I asked for a copy of it. I'm going to pass it on to you today. Many of you have probably heard it. It's a story written by Judy Voice, but it's a tremendous illustration of what happens to all of us when we have a bad day. This little boy's name is Alexander. Probably about 7 years of age, and what he really basically is beginning to say is that I had a day that nothing went right. The little guy can't win for losing. He went to sleep with gum in his mouth, woke up with it in his hair. When he got out of bed, he tripped over his skateboard and he dropped his sweater in the sink while the water was running, and he could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. And after a terrible day at school, a horrible visit with the dentist, and a no good stop at the shoe store, Alexander slumped into his chair at the supper table where his trouble continued. There were lima beans for dinner, and he hated limas. There was kissing on TV, and he hated kissing. His bath was too hot. He got soap in his eyes. His marble went down the drain. And he had to wear his railroad train pajamas, and he hated his railroad train pajamas. Don't you remember when you were a kid, having to wear something, like to bed in your pajamas that you just hated? Well, he hated his railroad train pajamas. And when he went to bed, one brother took back the pillow and he said that Alexander could keep, and the Mickey Mouse night light burned out, and the cat went to sleep with another brother and not with Alexander. And he said it's been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. And then at the close of the whole story, he says he's so tired, he says, I think I'm going to move to Australia. Well, haven't we had times in our life where we want to move to Australia? We want to move somewhere because we're in the middle of a crisis. We're in the middle of a very tough situation. A group of psychiatrists in Buffalo, New York, spent a week at a convention trying to discover and trying to define what life was. And after a week, their definition of life is stress, and you'd better like it. It's really true, and I want to talk to you about stress. I want to talk to you about conflict. I want to talk to you, most of all, about what happens when you and I get into a crisis. I have in your Enjoy Life lesson the terse verse, and that is, from the day of your birth to your ride in your hearse, things are never so bad that they couldn't get worse. There are two kinds of people. There are those who have problems, and there are those who are about to have problems. Alan Redpath is one of my very favorite Christian writers, and I love to read after him. And this great man of God said in one of his books, he said, if you are a Christian pastor, you are always in a crisis, either in the middle of one, coming out of one, or going into one. Isn't that true? In fact, when I talk to pastors and leaders across the country, I think the one thing that sets aside the pastor of a local church over other Christian workers is, I think if you're in a local church setting, either as a staff member like you are, or as a senior pastor like I am, I think you're always dealing with crisis situations. We're so close to where the action is that things just keep popping up. And I've often said, if you're going to be a full-time Christian worker and you don't like problems and you don't like conflict and you don't like crisis, you probably want to stay out of the local church. You want to you want to get on the circuit and speak, or you want to write books, or you want to be an evangelist. You want to do something, because whenever you deal with people and whenever you stay in the same situation and whenever you stay close to the grassroots, there will be always crisis that will appear. Let me give you a definition of a crisis. I was working on this lesson and on the road in Lansing, Michigan last week. And so I sat down, I thought, I ought to define crisis. And so this is a John Maxwell homemade definition of a crisis. When you can't say, let's forget the whole thing, you're in a crisis. Haven't we all had the times when we just wanted to wipe it out, throw it away, turn our back to it, pass it off to someone else? But when you can't let it go, in other words, when you can't say, let's forget about the whole thing, let's put that behind us, then you probably are in some type of a crisis. When you can't delegate it, when you can't ignore it, when you can't daydream around it, you probably have something that you have to fix. Interestingly enough, the Fuller survey recently came out and said that 40% of the pastors report a serious conflict with a parishioner at least once a month. So we're constantly in conflict. We are constantly in the middle of a crisis. And one guy said there are three things inevitable. We usually think of the two things, the death and taxes thing. He said there are three things that are inevitable. He said death, taxes, and conflict. And as I think about conflict, which really precedes crisis normally, There are many reasons, but let me give you three this morning. Let me give you three reasons for what I consider to be continual conflict that will affect our business, that will affect our church, whatever work we're in. I think number one is that we interact with people. And whenever you interact with people, there's going to be conflict. And whenever you have conflict, some of that will escalate up to a place with crisis because people are peculiar. People are funny. People are different. And when you bring people together, you have egos, you've got misunderstandings, you've got different agendas, you've got different motives. I mean, when you bring a group of people, I often tell pastors the only difference between a small church and a big church is the bigger the church, the more problems you have. Now, it's also the more potential you have. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You've got great potential, but you also have greater problems. And the reason you have greater problems with a large church is because you have more people. If you only have 30 people in a congregation or in a small group, you diminish your possibilities of conflict much more than if you have 3,000. The more people, the larger group there is, the more conflict and the more crisis that's going to usually appear. The second reason I think that we have continual conflict is that we live in a world of growing complexity and diversity. Our world is not as simple as it used to be. And because there is growing complexity and diversity, people come with much different opinions, much different perspectives. We are not one homogeneous unit. We are not all the same. We don't think the same. Hey, I'll tell you what, life used to be when you went in the ice cream store, vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry. That's the way life was. Life's no longer that way. You got 31 flavors, and you got the non-fat yogurt, and you got the fat yogurt, and it never ends. And when you bring that much diversity and you bring that much complexity, and I promise you, not everybody marches to the same drummer. Not everybody thinks the same thoughts. Not everybody has the same agenda. This makes sense, doesn't it, Steph? So the complexity and diversity helps to escalate the conflict. The third reason that we have continual conflict is that we are unable to control all situations. And when we cannot control the situation, conflict and then crisis will occur. I've often said it's true about parenting. The greatest days of parenting are when your kids are small. They just get in the car and wear the clothes you want them to wear, and they just do what you want them to do. But there comes a day when they become sometime in their teenage years where they get their own mind, where all of a sudden they've got to have the control, and it's a total different picture at that point. What happens? It's out of control. Well, that's not true in raising kids. That's true in raising an organization. That's true in working with people. When you don't have control, then all of a sudden things will rise that you don't particularly want to have rise. Now, Arnold Toynbee, who's a historian, and you've read probably after him before, says every nation, movement, or organization can face its crisis hours in one of four ways. Number one, here's what Toynbee says. When we have a crisis, we either, one, retreat to the past, and haven't I seen that? Haven't you seen that before? It's almost what I call the turtle response. Pull your neck in, get under the shell, absolutely let the world pass you by, ignore it, just kind of try to protect yourself. So we either, one, retreat in the past, two, leap into daydreams about the future. I see that happen a lot of times. A crisis appears, and people just literally leave the problem, wherever it is, and they begin to daydream about tomorrow, and it's going to get better. It's it's what I call, just like the first is the turtle kind of syndrome. This is the Annie syndrome. Tomorrow, there's going to be a better day tomorrow. The third way that we respond sometimes to crisis is that we become mystical, and I see this happen all the time. I see people, what they'll do is they'll retreat. This is very common, especially with Christians. They'll retreat into mysticism. And all of a sudden, they'll begin to talk mystically, and it's kind of out there, and they're just kind of, there's some demons out there, or there's something out there, and they bring in a lot of mysticism. Now, there may be spiritual warfare, but I'm here to tell you right now, a lot of people, what they think of spiritual warfare has nothing to do with spiritual warfare. They just need to fix some issues in their life. And I watch pastors sometimes when a problem breaks out, well, we're in the middle of spiritual warfare. I said, no, you just made a stupid decision over here. Don't bring the devil in. Quit giving him so much credit. Just be a better leader and get smart and fix your problem. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with demons and people out there and evil and communists behind the bush and all that stuff. And I watch them sometimes, they just retreat into some mysticism when what they really need is not to be a mystic, they just need to face the issue and be practical. Now, the fourth way that we respond sometimes to crisis, that Toynbee says, and this is what the lesson's all about, there are those who take hold of the crisis and transform it into something useful. And that's my entire goal of doing this lesson on what to do in a crisis, is to help you and to help me as a staff and to help our Enjoy Life listeners. And those that use this tape not only as in an audio and a listening way, but those who use it as in a video, in a teaching way, in retreats or at staff conferences or whatever, it's my goal now to begin to help you to transform, change that crisis into something that is useful. In fact, I love the way that I've headed the practical part of this lesson now, and that is how to take the crisis out of the crisis. Let's go right in the middle of the storm for a moment, and let's see if we can defang it and be able to not make the crisis always the crisis. When I do at conferences, sometimes I talk about stress and what happens, and pastors ask me how I deal with stress, and once in a while, if I'm on a roll, I'll tell them the story that of how I handle stress, and one of the ways that I handle stress is I go out the golf course, and I take a golf ball out of my bag, and I take a magic marker, and I put the name of the person that's causing me so much trouble. And I put the name Bill, and I write his name on that golf ball, and now I've got Bill in my hand, and I tee Bill up. And if the fairway is that way, and the woods are that way, I line up with my golf club that way, and I take Bill, and I usually have my best drive when I do this, by the way, because there's tremendous incentive behind putting Brother Bill in the sea of forgetfulness. You know what I'm saying? And I hit that ball. I remember I was with a guy one time. I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "This guy's causing me a problem." I'll tell you what I do if people cause me problems. And I lined up the woods, hit old Bill in the woods, and, just banging, hitting those trees. And every time Bill hits another tree, I'm saying, "Praise Jesus, amen, hallelujah," And all of a sudden, he hits another tree, and he comes out right back towards me and rolls right at my feet. Didn't have to take a step. I literally could reach down and pick Bill up. Picked him up, put him in a golf bag, looked at my buddy Tom I was playing golf with. I said, there are some people you just never can get rid of. There are some problems that seem to keep coming back. There are some crises that continue to reoccur. But what my goal is now is to give you a plan to handle crisis effectively. Number one, let's go. Number one, anticipate the crisis. We need to go through life not being blindsided. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about being negative in your thinking to the place where you're always depressed because you know it's a good day, but you know before the day it's going to get bad because you somehow anticipate this dark cloud coming. I'm not talking about having a depressed lifestyle. What I'm really talking about is being on guard, understanding that we're going to have a crisis. In fact, one of the things I do with pastors and leadership conferences is I have them look at each other and tell them, you're going to have problems. You're going to have more problems. In fact, I tell them here at this church growth conference or this leadership conference, and you probably have a dozen people leaving your church while you're here trying to learn how to grow one. You're going to have problems. We're all going to have problems. I've got them. You've got them. All God's children got problems. And there has to be a sense of us being able to live with problems. Not ignore them, but to be able to live with them. The day that I want to escape problems is the day I'll never be effective again, because you never, in any area, business or church or whatever it is, you're never going to get away from crisis. So there's a certain kind of anticipation. It's like the kid in college I love to tell about, the kid who flunked all of his courses, got kicked out of school, sent a telegram home to his mother. "I flunked all my courses, been kicked out of school, prepare pop." In which he got a telegram the next day from his mother, said, "Pop prepared. Prepare yourself." I mean, get ready, anticipate. There is a crisis when you come home. There is a problem. And in your notes I have, you cannot prepare for a crisis without anticipating it. Anticipation begins with the simple knowledge that crisis can and will occur. Heroic leaders accept the fact that they are not invincible, that even the best made plans will at some point come up against unforeseen obstacles. They know that just because you can't foresee a crisis doesn't mean you can't anticipate the inevitability of that crisis. I started reading a book last week. It's entitled, it's a great title, The Genius of Sitting Bull. It's the story of Sitting Bull, who was the chief of the Sioux in the war or the battle against Custer. And you know the story, if you know the history, the whole story of Custer's last stand was truly Custer's last stand. And what it does is it literally has 13 strategies that Sitting Bull used to defeat Custer. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And anyway, I'm going to read 2 paragraphs out of the book. It said, now listen to this carefully. The Sioux, that's who Sitting Bull, of course, was the chief of, the Sioux had learned to prepare for crisis throughout centuries of living with the dangers of their ever-changing environment. A product of his culture, Sitting Bull remained acutely aware of the dangers that lack of preparation could engender, and he kept himself closely attuned to all the elements of his environment that could suddenly change and plunge him into a life-threatening situation. And it goes on to talk about how Sitting Bull had a plan B for every type of possibility when he went into battle. Now, now it talks about Custer. It said, while Custer, too, had experienced crisis during the Civil War, he was too starstruck by the opportunity to shine in battle to consider the all-too-real possibility of crisis threatening his campaign against the Sioux. And he had for so long led the charmed life of a commander who could do no wrong that he assumed that his confrontation with his enemy would go according to plan with no unforeseen backup or other types of development in case it went wrong. Well, you know what happened. In fact, as you read that whole story, it's a wonderful story. I didn't realize it until I read the book, that he thought that this campaign would bring him into the White House and the presidency. And so all along the way, as he was going to fight Sitting Bull and the Sioux, he talked about to people, and he had a card that he gave out the White House address, in which he basically said, when I become president, you can come and see me. You know? And so what's Custer doing? Custer is at the White House. Sitting Bull is getting plan B, can't plan C. Of course, you know exactly what happened. What? Sitting Bull anticipated the crisis. A crisis, in your notes, many times becomes a crisis because we did not anticipate it. I remember reading a story of, who was it, Corbett, one of the heavyweight champions, I believe. It said they asked him what punch knocked him out. And he said, it's not the hardest punch, it's the one I didn't see. And I thought that's very true about crisis, too. It's the one that we didn't see. All of a sudden, boom, it's got us, and we're down. And what happened to us, that whole process. And I can remember a major mistake I made back in 1989 when we changed the Living Christmas Tree. And we've talked about this, staff, and we changed the Sunday p.m. service. And my assumption that I'd been here long enough to make changes without backup plans, without communication, and how for 3 or 4 months we staggered a little bit as a congregation. The only reason was it was my fault. You know what I didn't do? I didn't anticipate a crisis. I began to be a little bit like Custer, a little bit too just settled in, and it'll be fine, and this will work out, and didn't have plan B or plan C. Well, I love this part here. You know it's going to be a bad year. This is from Christian Herald magazine. When the government notifies you that your Social Security number has been revoked, that your personal computer threatens to tell all. As the moving van starts to unload next door, the first 4 items down the wrap are dirt bikes. Your 14-year-old daughter insists Jesus never preached against pierced noses. Your ailing station wagon fails to qualify for the demolition derby. Upon arriving home from a week in the Bahamas, you can't find your Bible with 6 months of Sunday school plans tucked inside. Your new boss asks if you filled your old position yet, if they have. Your pacemaker is recalled by the manufacturer. Your church treasurer says the IRS called today or the other day for some of your donation totals. Anticipate the crisis. Number 2. Second thing to do in a crisis is accept what has happened. Accept what has happened. Here's what I find among many people who go through difficult times. Instead of accepting what is happening, they want to defend what is happening. I want to tell you something right now. As long as you try to defend the situation, you'll never fix it. Now, there are 3 common choices from a crisis. Refuse to accept it, but just put up with it, or accept it and try to benefit from it. Now, right behind refuse to accept it, put the word failure. If you and I refuse to accept what the crisis is, we're going to fail. Behind accept it, but we just put up with it, put survival. If we do that, what we're going to do is we're just going to survive. But if we accept it and try to benefit from it, then we're going to grow. And that's what we're going after. We're going after personal growth within our life. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, says, This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It's a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it has been accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. Most do not fully see this truth, that life is difficult, and instead they moan more or less incessantly, noisily or subtly, about the enormity of their problems, as if life were generally easy, as if life should be easy. Paul Harvey said one time, he says, in times like these, it's good to remember that there have always been times like these. Accept it. In fact, I had Dottie bring a sign I have in my office that I've had in my office for a couple years now. Somebody made it for me. I don't know who made it for me, but it says it all. Yesterday ended last night. I know all kind of people have never understood this sign. And they're still going back, and they're trying to defend something they did yesterday instead of saying, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I blew it, I made a mistake. They're constantly going, I know pastors who are constantly going back to their churches and say, well, back there, it wasn't my fault. And instead of just accepting where they are, listen, gang, the good news is yesterday ended last night. The issue is not the crisis anymore. Once you have the crisis, the issue is not the crisis. You know what the issue is? What are you going to do about it? The issue is not, do we have a problem? Yes, we have a big problem. Now, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to look at it? There has to be a certain acceptance of crisis and trouble and problems, and a willingness for us to have an understanding of that yes, we're in those problems. When I was in Israel last year, one of our guides, a fellow by the name of Amir, what a wonderful guide he was. He talked to us about a guy named Elie Wiesel, who is a Jewish fellow that has done a lot of scholarly writings, and he was a good friend of him and wanted to know if we knew him. Of course, I didn't know him, but I've read some of his stuff. He's got a great sense of humor. And I when I was working on this lesson on crisis, I happened to have this. It's called Religious Views on Trouble. Remember, I'm talking about accepting what has happened. And let me just read it to you. Just listen. And he's got all the different religions and how they view trouble. For example, Taoism, Wiesel says, Taoism says trouble happens. Confucianism says, Confucius says trouble happens. Buddhism, if trouble happens, it is not really trouble. Zen Buddhism, what is the sound of trouble happening? Hinduism, this trouble has happened before. Islam, if trouble happens, it is the will of Allah. Protestantism, let trouble happen to someone else. Catholicism, if trouble happens, you deserve it. Judaism, why does always trouble happen to us? Isn't that beautiful? Why is everybody always picking on me? Remember I know most of you don't remember the old Coaster song, Charlie Brown, but that's the Jewish people. Why is everybody always picking on me? Okay, accept the crisis. Okay, now, after you've accepted what has happened, after you've come to a place where you have anticipated it, number 3, see the big picture. If we're going to fix the problem, what we have to do is we have to get a big picture view of what's happening. Again, it is so common for people in leadership positions to try to microscope in instead of getting overview of what's happening. Helen Keller, boy, didn't she say it right. When one door of happiness closes, another, but often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. Abraham Maslow said, this is one of my favorite quotes, a quote that they use a lot in Japan. If the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. Boy, is that not the truth. That's so true. And what I'm asking you now, as we're looking at this crisis in step number 3, is I'm asking you to open your mind. You know, the mind's like a parachute. It works best when it's open. And I'm asking you, and the problem is when a crisis comes, you know what our tendency is? Instead of open up, our tendency is to close in, to narrow in and begin to say, now what's the problem here? And begin to get microscopic instead of big picture. Now, there are 3 reasons why we usually fail to see a big picture in a crisis. Letter A, lack of experience. And I think that that is truly not only letter A, but I think it truly is the number one reason. I'm 46. One of my different views at 46 than when I was 30 is this. I've watched people, and there is nothing that will fill the bill for good leadership like good experience. And when you don't have it, you just don't have the whole picture in front of you. Now, when I was 25 or 30, I didn't understand that. And every issue that came up, I went after the issue and did my best, and some I did well, some I didn't do well. But at 46, I can tell you right now, there's nothing that substitutes just having a lot of good success under your belt. Been there, done that. Already faced that issue, fixed it well. In my mentoring of Dan as executive pastor, I said, Dan, one of the things you'll learn, and it'll take you about 5 to 8 years to learn it, and he's learning it very fast. He may learn it quicker than 5 to 8 years. Is I said, you'll have guys come in the door, and they'll have issues and deals, and you'll work with those issues, but I said, after a while, there'll be patterns. And every time you have to deal with an issue, you'll think, oh, 2 years ago, this happened. Here's how you fix this. And you develop this incredible bank. Now, I want to say, when I talk about experience, I'm not trying to glorify experience. There are many people who have been in ministry for 20 years, but they've not had 20 years of experience. They've been in the ministry for 20 years, but they've had 1 year of experience 20 times. And there's a difference. I'm not talking about that. You got me? I'm not talking about the person who never learns, never grows. But I'm saying there's nothing to substitute having been there, having done that successfully, and having what it allows you to do as far as thinking through a crisis. Now, I don't mean this wrong, but I can tell you what was a crisis to me at 25 is not a crisis to me at 45. Not because I'm trying to poo-poo issues. It's just an issue. I've gone through all that. You've gone through all of that. And I love watching people, different generations, different groups, as they're going through these issues of life. And those issues are real issues, as long as they just understand that this too shall pass, and this is what I'm learning, this is how I'm growing. But lack of experience causes us not to see the big picture. It is, staff, the weakest link at Skyline. The weakest link I have here is all you good young faces. The good news is we got energy, we got a lot of vision, we got a lot of fire, we got a lot of vibrancy, we got a lot of good stuff that young people bring. The bad news is lack of experience. And I see it, and I'm just a kid myself. I'm only 46. That's why I brought Fred on. I want to get somebody with some gray hair, somebody that's been there, done that. I want to tell you what, it's a world of difference. I wanted to get a little balance. I wanted to be able to not just have just a bunch of wonderful, good, God-blessing young bucks that are going out there doing something great for God, but I wanted to get a little experience. Number 2, letter B, lack of confidence. Lack of confidence causes us many times not to see the big picture. I'm going to tell you why. When you lack confidence, you lack openness. And when you lack openness, you lack vulnerability. And when you lack vulnerability, the people that are causing the problem can't come in and tell you what the problem is because you aren't receptive to it. And you literally short-circuit the whole issue. And you know what confidence allows you to do? I'll tell you what confidence allows me to do. Confidence allows me to look at somebody and say, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I messed up. I didn't do well. Will you forgive me? I'll try to do better. You show me an insecure person, I'll show you a person that's defensive. I'll show you a person that won't say I'm sorry. I'll show you a person that'll try to protect themselves. I'll show you a person that'll get a wall around them. Does this make sense? Okay, letter C. The third reason we fail to see the big picture is when we become emotionally dominated by the issue. And this happens all the time. When I say emotionally dominated by the issue is, we all know what it's like to panic in a crisis. Isn't that right? And when we panic in a crisis, we begin to be emotionally dominant instead of mentally dominant. And the moment we become emotionally dominant instead of mentally dominant, our emotions go into gear, but our thinking goes out of gear. And the moment that our thinking goes out of gear, then we're in major trouble. Okay? Now, 3 reasons, again, that we fail to see the big picture. Lack of experience, lack of confidence, and we become emotionally dominant. Now, how do you see the big picture? When we're in a crisis, what do? Well, I think that there are a couple things that will really help you to really see the big picture in a crisis. Letter A, bring problem solvers around you. The best thing I would suggest is bring people that you have confidence in their counseling and wisdom around you to help you see the issues and see the problems. I love that quote. Swap problems because we all know exactly how to solve other people's problems. And isn't that the truth? Man, I can always solve yours, and you can always solve mine as long as I don't have to deal with my own. Just swap problems. I made a decision 2 years ago. I think it's one of the best decisions I ever made. I made a decision a couple of years ago not to make major decisions on my own anymore. It's one of the best decisions I ever made. Now, you got to understand, that was very difficult for me because I can make major decisions while I'm going to the drinking fountain. Decision-making has never been a problem in my life. And I understand that very well with my 14-year-old son, Joe Porter. I understand. Some people have no problem making decisions. I can tell you right now, I can never, ever remember being paralyzed saying, oh, man, I hope I can make this decision right. I've always had confidence. I could always make decisions. But now, just because you have confidence in making decisions don't mean they're right. Just means you have confidence, you know. He was confident as he blew himself up and blew the organization up. He just felt real good the day everything went, the day the Titanic went down. He said, I think we're going to be all right here. Now, 2 years ago, I decided that I have too much going on in my life and I have too many people I affect. And so I just submitted myself to my wife, Margaret, and to Dick Peterson and John Hinkle. And I don't make any major decisions, without those three minds plus my mind in the same room. And it's been unbelievable. They've helped me so many times. I want to tell you what, there have been times when I was going the wrong way, and they'd say, hey, John, how about over here? I've made a determination to bring Dan into this process, to begin to mentor him in the same way. And with the church, it's that way now. But what I'm saying to you is that if you really want to help yourself in a crisis, bring some key people around you. You know, the proverb writer says there's much wisdom in the counsel of many. Now, I want to preface that statement a little bit because it's not a promise. It's, you know, the Proverbs are kind of life-changing principles is what they really are. They're not promises. Whenever I hear anybody do Proverbs as promises, I want to stop a little bit and say, I think it's just a good man thinking some good thoughts. Don't bank your life on everything. But when it says, good, you know, much wisdom in the counsel of many, I would say much wisdom in good counsel, period. 2 or 3 people. I don't want everybody's advice. Some people's advice I don't even want. But you get the good people around you. Get people that you really trust, that you believe in. The second thing to help you see the big picture is ask questions. And I just decided to list the question for you because I thought it would be simpler maybe. When confronted by an impossible crisis, I love this quote, it is easier solved by reducing it to this question. How would the Lone Ranger have handled this? That brings great guidance to me. I was doing my Lone Ranger routine the other day in a leadership conference, and some kid didn't even know who the Lone Ranger was. Man, I sat and I thought, what a deprived childhood. You know what I'm saying? Never to have lived with a Lone Ranger. It's a terrible thing that's happening. That's the reason our younger generation is not turning out well. But anyway, questions to ask during a crisis. Here we go. 1, what is the problem? 2, what is the background? 3, what is the worst thing that could happen? 4, what is the best thing that could happen? What are the possible options? What is the best option? How should this option be processed? Did this course of action work? What did we learn? Is there a plan to keep from this happening again? And finally, did I train anyone during the ordeal so they could learn how to handle the crisis? Good questions, aren't they? Just good questions to ask. Okay, to get the big picture, bring problem solvers around you, ask questions. Letter C, remember others have come through crisis. One of the most interesting things I find when a person's in a crisis is there's a tendency for them to think that they're the only one going through a crisis. And it's just easy for us. Isn't it easy for us to get just in, grow and say, wow, I guess I'm the one with really major problems? In Dwight Baumbach's book, What's Right with America, I don't know if you read it or not, wrote it back in '86. He said America's elders lived through the great 1929 stock market crash that ruined many of their families. They lived through the Depression years, the bonus march on Washington, the veterans that were dispersed by Army troops, the New Deal years, Pearl Harbor, the loss of the Philippines, years of long days and nights in defense plants in the 1940s, fighting in Europe and the Pacific, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, VE Day, the hope-filled beginning of the United Nations in America, the A-bomb, the AJ Day, the Marshall Plan in Europe, the Berlin airlift, the war in Korea, the U-2 incident, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the killings of Presidents Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Struggle, the Vietnam War, Americans on the Moon, Watergate and the resignation and the vice president, the president and the vice president, the energy crisis of 3 Mile Island, the Iranian hostages, a new president shot in 1981, the bombing of our embassy, the hundreds of Marines in Lebanon, becoming a debtor nation with the highest budget deficit in history. And then he concludes by saying, what a lifetime. Now, what I get out of this whole paragraph is very simple. Every generation has its crisis. Everybody has its problems. And there's no such thing as me coming to a new day where the problems are great and they didn't have those problems. The only problem today is we've got so many therapists around, we're just more aware of all of our problems. And so, it's kind of like, wow, if you don't get in a group, you kind of feel left out of it after a while. You know what I'm saying? We may at Skyline develop a group for whole people and just, see if anybody wants to show up, just to sit around and talk about life's not that bad after all. And we have, Margaret and I sat down one day and she said, John, why is it that we don't have as many crises as other people? I said, Margaret, let's think about it. So I got legal pad. We sat down for about 30 minutes. I wrote all things that we've gone through in our lifetime, in our marriage. And we felt a whole legal pad of crisis. And we started kind of laughing at each other. And you know what our ending result was? The fact we don't have issues and problems and crises. You name it, we've done it. We've been there. But it's an issue of how we view the crisis. And again, I'm here to talk to you about it's not the fact that you're not going to have a problem. It's how we respond. You see, we cannot control the crisis, but we can control how we respond to it. That's what we're going after. Okay, review. If you want to effectively deal with a crisis, how do you take the crisis out of a crisis? Number 1, anticipate it. 2, accept what has happened. 3, see the big picture. Number 4, do what is right. When we're in the middle of a crisis, what happens when we get in a real big issue, here's what crisis does. A crisis has a tendency to put a squeeze on our character. Doesn't that make sense? Don't we emotionally begin to deal with issues on the inside when a crisis comes that begins to? It's like pressing the toothpaste. Something's going to come out, and it begins to put the squeeze on our character. Do you remember, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago now? Remember when the Tylenol problem came out? Remember when somebody ate something, they poisoned, and they'd been tampered with, and they were poisoned, they died? It was an interesting thing what happened. Now, there's a major crisis. I mean, we're talking about a company. Was it Johnson & Johnson? A company that could have gone down. Now watch this. I know for a fact, because I read on this, the FDA, the FBI, Wall Street put a lot of pressure on them to say, well, this has just been the tampering of a madman, and just to take a couple of their, just to kind of be in a holding position and declare themselves that a madman's done this, and this is the exception. But you remember what they did? They took every capsule, Tylenol, every bottle off of every shelf in America. Cost them millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. They took them all off. And remember, that's when they made the tampering-proof kind of a thing that you could tell if somebody had tampered with it. Here's what's interesting, and this is a fact. When they got through this crisis, they took a poll. 93% of the people in America said 2 things about Tylenol. Number 1, they admired how they handled the crisis. And number 2 is they said that they would buy the Tylenol capsules. 93%. And you know what it all was? I can tell you exactly what it was. It was Tylenol decided to do what was right. Tylenol decided to take what I call the big gulp. You know what the big gulp is? The big gulp is look at somebody in the eye and say, you're right, I'm wrong. The big gulp is to say, I messed up. The big gulp is to say, I'm sorry. It's that whole process. And they did what is right. Now, our tendency, instead of doing what is right like Tylenol, our tendency is, do you know what to do? To point to the madman. And say, well, some idiot came in here. It's not our fault that somebody went in there and tampered on. The issue is always to do this number, to point to someone else instead of look at ourselves. Number 5, in a crisis, decide one thing at a time. In other words, when you and I are in the middle of a crisis, don't allow all the problems to hit us at once. Richard Sloma says, it's in your notes, never try to solve all the problems all at once. Make them line up for you, one by one. Whether you face 3 problems, 30, or 300, make them stand in single file so that you face only one at a time. It's like old Casey Stengel. Remember Casey Stengel, the manager of the New York Yankees? That great, oh man, what a great manager. I'm telling stories that are too old, I can tell. But there was a great Casey Stengel. What a great! He's during a pennant race when the stress would get on and the pressure of the players. He had a favorite saying, as we play them one game at a time. One game at a time. We play them one game. That's what I mean. Make them line up. You know what I call it? I call it the divide and conquer issue. What I do is I get a legal pad out. When I'm in a crisis, I put all the elements out in front of me. Issues, people, situations. I put them all out in front of me. And then what I do, after I get them all in front of me so I can visually see them, I begin to separate them and I begin to divide them. And I begin to look at them in groups. And as I begin to divide them in groups, I just kind of put circles around them or put a letter by them to identify them. Then what I do is I say, okay, what's the first step? And I take these groups or these issues and I put the first issue I ought to deal with, the second issue, the third issue, and I literally line them up so that I have a process to deal with that crisis. In your notes, I love this. You've read this before, I'm sure. The object of all dedicated employees should be to thoroughly analyze all instructions, anticipate all the problems prior to their occurrence, have answers for these problems, and move swiftly to solve these problems when called upon. However, when you're up to your neck in alligators, it's difficult to remind yourself that your initial objective was to drain the swamp. Huh? And isn't that the truth, huh? How many times we instead of, we just forgot to drain the swamp. Okay, one thing at a time. Number 6. Oh, this is good stuff. Number 6, don't get emotionally hooked. I almost said involved, but I think hook's a stronger word here. Don't get emotionally hooked when you get in the middle of a crisis. Boy, that's the hard part, isn't it? We're going to deal with some real issues here. In fact, I want to make sure we get it, so I'm going to define it. Getting emotionally hooked, it's in your notes. It's one of the easiest, the most common, and most dangerous facets of problem solving. None of us is immune to it. Boy, I'm not. We're all succumbed many times to our emotions at one point or another, and we will again probably soon. You're emotionally hooked when your emotions are in control, when you can no longer think logically. You are hooked when you don't really care about the problem anymore. You simply want to satisfy your feelings. Boy, I see that all the time. I see people in the middle of a crisis. You know what their number one desire is? Their number one desire is to fix the problem. Their number one desire is to get emotionally relieved. I see it all the time. It's the old Harry Truman, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. It's that whole process, the heat's up, and all of a sudden we say, it's a good idea. I think I'm going to get out of the kitchen. Schuller taught me this principle many years ago, the peak-to-peak principle. Boy, it's a powerful principle. I probably ought to have a board to illustrate it, but I think I can explain it so that you can do it on your notes. There are some people who go from peak to peak, from success to success, and you ask yourself, why did they do that? Why have they been able to just make one decision after another? And it seems like they have the Midas touch, and everything turns to gold. And other people literally go from bad decision to bad decision to bad decision. Schuller calls it the peak-to-peak principle, which he basically says that our emotions are down and they're up, and it's a roller coaster. Don't we have our good days emotionally, our weaker days emotionally? And here's what he says. He says, if you want to be a good decision maker, this is good for a crisis. He says, never make a major decision until you're on top of the peak emotionally. Don't make them. How many times I've seen pastors leave churches when they're in the valley? And all they do is when they make a bad decision, when we're at the bottom of the valley, all they make is what they make? They don't make a good decision. They make an emotional decision. And then by making that emotional decision, they say, I can escape. And I can slip out. And so if you are emotionally down, if you're down in that valley, wait till you get back up at the top of that peak before you make that major decision. That will keep you from becoming emotionally hooked in the crisis itself. When having done nothing else to stand, what's the Bible say? Stand. Wait till you get on that peak. Number 7. The 7th thing to do in a crisis is never give up on a major goal when you are down. This is very close to being emotionally hooked, but it's not the same. Let me just share with you that sometimes during a crisis, there's a tendency for us to be down emotionally and give up what our major objective or goal was. It's kind of like, if I can just get relief, I'll open up the windows and throw this out of the car. I'll do anything I can if I can just get personal relief. And what happens so many times is we have a very good goal. We have a very good objective. We're really wanting to go the right way. Just because you're in a crisis doesn't mean you're not on the right road. What it means is you maybe have a roadblock, you maybe have been delayed, maybe you have been detoured, but it doesn't mean and a lot of times we're going this way and we get in a crisis and finally we think, well, I've got to get that major goal. I hear people all the time say, well, I just don't think it can be done. I just don't think I can do it. I don't think it can be done. And they sometimes give up their major goal. And let me tell you what a crisis does. A crisis suffocates your creativity if you don't handle it correctly. It emotionally boxes in and fences in your ability to create. And so what happens is, when we begin to lose our creativity, I can promise you this. You show me a person that loses their creativity, and I'll show you a person that will lose every major goal that they ever set in life. And here's why. There's no major goal that you ever set in life that's going to be easy. And you're going to run up against dead ends. And you've got to get creative to figure out how am I going to get to that major goal without losing it. That's why I put a couple quotes in your notes. Nothing is more dangerous than an idea when it's the only one we have. Boy, isn't that true? And creativity is being able to look at whatever people are looking at and think something totally different. We have been taught to look for the right answer. However, there are often several right answers. I believe it, I believe it, I believe it. Start by looking for the second right answer. In other words, don't give up your goal when you're down in a crisis. If it's a good goal, hold on to it. Just get creative on another way to handle it. I think it was a leadership cartoon. I saw a cartoon by Johnny Hankins one did it. And it's a pastor on the telephone at his desk. And he's talking to somebody that's not happy. I can tell. He says, suppose we return your tithes, give you a reserved parking place, make you an elder, fire the youth pastor, and eliminate the music committee. Would that be satisfactory? Haven't we all in our life been willing to give away, sell our birthright? Hey, sell our birthright for a bowl of porridge just so we could get something to eat because we're in a crisis and we're hungry and we want the quick fix. Don't give up your goals. Number 8, don't take yourself seriously. When you're in a crisis, remember this. Hey, you know what, gang? There's a day when John Maxwell's going to die and the sun's going to rise the next morning and everybody isn't going to give a hoot. And the moment you understand that, the moment that I understand where I am according to life, it will allow me an awful lot of humor in life in the midst of a crisis. Chuck Swindoll said, of all the things God created, I'm often most grateful that he created laughter. And boy, hasn't he brought laughter to all of us. Unlike Charlie Brown, who only dreads life one day at a time, God wants us to have fun and enjoy life. He wants us to have a joyful spirit when we approach our problems. Having fun releases our problem-solving abilities and gives us an objective and flexible frame of reference. So laugh away your trouble. Hey, I got this the other day, and I just love it. It's not in your notes, but listen to it. 10 thoughts that will get you through a crisis. 10 thoughts to get you through a crisis. Number 1, indecision is the key to flexibility. Number 2, you can't tell which way the train went by looking. Number 3, there's absolutely no substitute for a genuine lack of preparation. Number 4, I'll get notes on this one. All things being equal, fat people use more soap. Number 5, if you can smile when things go wrong, you have someone in mind to blame. Isn't that it? Oh, I feel good. Yeah, him. I love this one. Here's another thought to get you through a crisis. 1/7 of your life is spent on Mondays. Here's another. By the time you make ends meet, they move the ends. Oh, here's another one. Things are more like they are today than they ever were before. Friends may come and go, but enemies accumulate. This is the final one. This is as bad as it can get, but don't bet on it. Huh? Things, that's a thing. Just laugh at yourself. Just lighten up. Number 9, remember your successes. Remember your successes. We know the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of the characters meaning both danger and opportunity. In other words, it's going to either sink us or make us many times. And our biggest crisis many times comes right before God's biggest opportunity in our life. I did an exercise when I was working on this lesson about some things that I've had that were successful, of which When success comes, I almost promise you that there are three things that happen. When success comes, I promise you, first of all, anything you and I have ever done that we look back and we say we were successful in. I mean, it's something that we cherish, that we have good memories of. You know what I'm saying? I promise you, anything that we almost cherish, have good memories of, that we look back and say I was successful, I promise you three things happened. One, there was a challenge that was bigger than us. I mean, in other words, it was something bigger than life, and we're saying, my God, I don't think I can do this. It's bigger than life. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than everything else. So there was a challenge out there that we kind of gulped when we looked at it. I want to tell you the second thing that happens, I promise you, is self-doubt. We look at that challenge and we said, can I make it? Do I have what it takes? Isn't that true? And the third thing that happens is a commitment. We made a commitment. Sink or swim, we were going after it. Now, those are three things I promise you. Every time there's as we look back, now, just think of it for a moment. You know what I believe? I believe that when we look back at those situations, there are two of the three we remember, but there's one we forget. I believe we remember the challenge, and I believe the commitment. But I think we forget the self-doubt. I catch myself going through something, and I forget, I wasn't sure I could do that when I pulled that one off back there. I wasn't sure. And I think so many times that's why self-doubt comes back. So when I have self-doubt this time, I forget that I had self-doubt the last time. It may be a little different, but it's still, can I do this? Can I pull this out? And what I'm saying to you is, in remembering your successes, remember not only the challenge and the commitment, but remember, sure, it's okay to have a little self-doubt. It's okay to say, now, do I have the stuff to make it? When we don't remember that we had self-doubt in our last success, when we have self-doubt in this crisis, there's a tendency to think that we're not going to make it. But it's good to remember that you had doubt in the last one, because then you kind of say, it's okay. I wasn't sure I could last time, and I'm not sure I can last, but I did it last time, so maybe I can do it this time. Makes sense, doesn't it? Number 10. Learn from your crisis. In fact, let me tell you something about a crisis. I believe a crisis will come back again and be another crisis unless you learn from the crisis. You know, my number one question to any leader would be very simple. Not that you have crisis. Can I tell you something? I got him, you got him. I got him, you got him. That's life. Do you know the question I would always ask a leader who said, well, I'm in another crisis? Wouldn't be, oh, man, another crisis? You're in another. Of course you are. If you're in the heat of the battle, you're probably going to have more crisis than if you're back there in a pup tent 5 miles from the line. So the issue isn't crisis. The question I would always ask is this. Is it the same crisis you had 6 months ago? You see, when the same problem keeps occurring, folks, listen to me carefully, staff. Listen to me carefully, Enjoy Life listeners. When the crisis continues to appear, the same one, you're not learning from it. I know pastors who go from church to church to church because they've never fixed problems in their life that create the crisis. I got a wonderful pastor friend of mine who's moved many, many times from church to church. And you know what his problem is? He's never learned from the crisis that he had. And the only way that he'll ever be a success is if he could get away from himself, because he's the problem. When a crisis appears, that doesn't mean that it's our problem. It doesn't mean that we're the problem all the time, but if it keeps coming back, we're not learning from it. Chuck Colson, of course, is a perfect example of that, and I just read one of his testimonies. Chuck Colson said when he was in prison, he said, I began to take stock in my life. You know, of course, he's in the White House, right hand of the president, the whole process. And here's what he said. All of my achievements meant nothing in God's economy. My greatest humiliation, being sent to prison, was the beginning of God's greatest use for my life. Now I could see that after I lose everything that I thought had made Chuck Colson such a great person, what God intended for me to be, and the true purpose of my life, God does not want our success. He wants us. They said, when all of a sudden, when I began to take evaluation, the day I was born was the day I was in prison. And what did he do? You know what he did? I'll tell you what he did. He learned from his success. John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State for Eisenhower, great statesman, He said, to measure success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem that you had last year. And what we do is our tendency is we play the blame game. When people are in crisis, I watch them all the time. They want to blame someone else. You know, in marriages, it's my wife. If I could just get my wife straight, I'm not married to be together. A businessman, well, if I could just get those people to follow me. Always want to point. You know, here's the two things that people do when they get in crisis. The most often that hurt them is they either go to the blame game or the pity party. They either go suck their thumb and say, oh, well, God, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Let's sing it one more time. Got some violins? Come on in here. Let's do it. We either go to the pity party or we begin to blame others for our problem. The other day when I was in a leadership conference, they asked me, they were talking about problems. And I shared something with pastors that I watched them kind of write it down, and I didn't write it down, so I had to come away from it and try to remember it so I could write it down, because I could tell when I said it, it spoke to them. But it's just kind of one of these off-the-cuff conversations, but all of a sudden I saw they grabbed hold of it. I was sharing with pastors, if you catch yourself what I call behind the eight ball and you're in problems, you got a real crisis, I said there are three things you want to do. I said, number one, you got to identify the problem. The second thing you got to do, and this is the hard one, I don't think identifying the problem is the hardest. The second thing you have to do is settle the issue. And when I say settle the issue, I don't mean go outside and fix the problem. I'm saying go inside and begin to settle issues in your life that you need to inwardly fix before you can outwardly fix the problem. And number three, ask forgiveness. If every pastor in America that's in a crisis right now would identify the problem, settle the issues inwardly of where they are in relationship to that problem, and ask forgiveness. I learned a long time ago that you can spend hours negotiating, debating, arguing, fighting, but the moment you look at somebody and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, all the air goes out. It takes a pretty bad person after you tell them you're sorry to keep stepping on you. It takes a pretty tough nut after you say, I was wrong, to go get the gun and shoot some more. Because what I found is most of the time when I say I was wrong, and I want to tell you about every crisis I've ever had, I was wrong. The moment I said that, it brought a whole new level of playing field. And to where somebody else can say, you know what? My attitude's wrong in some areas too. And all of a sudden, that moves the door open for reconciliation. One more thing as I close. I save everything. I won't say I save everything. I save everything that's good. And collect. And so when I do these enjoy lessons, people say, well, how do you get all your material? Well, that's the very fact. I've been collecting since I was 17 years of age. If you can't get a bunch of material by that time, after 30 years of collecting, you're pretty bad, aren't you? And so my only thing I feel bad about is on the back of a tithe envelope. It's probably what they did is wrote me a note instead of giving me the tithe. Now that I think about it, but what I wish the person who wrote this to me would have given their name, but I don't. So I don't remember who did it. But it's a quote from Swindoll that the person gave, and I just filed it. And when I got ready for this lesson, I just pulled it out, and here it is. And I'm going to use this in close. Here's what Swindoll said: each new morning before you awaken, life makes a delivery to your front door, rings the doorbell, and runs. Each package is cleverly wrapped. Put together, they comprise a series of challenging opportunities brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. They are wrapped in paper with big print. Watch out. Better worry about this. Danger. This will bring fear. Impossible. You'll never handle this. Here's what he said. When you hear the ring in the morning, try something new. Have Jesus Christ answer the door for you. Pretty good, isn't it? Huh? Do our best and then let him make up the difference. Father, I thank you for our time together. I ask that you'll help me, my staff, our Enjoy Life listeners, when the next crisis appears, to get out this blueprint for success. Follow it, and may you come alongside of us and make up the difference. This I pray in your name. Amen.